Hello, my name's Wendy Thorogood, the Director of the Association of Child Protection Professionals, and I'm excited to introduce you to some colleagues that we've worked with over many years to raise a subject that's very close to my heart. I always say that if public health could invest in early prevention of childhood abuse, it would really make a difference. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So do you want to introduce yourself, Jenny, then to start?
I'm Jenny Gray. I am on the editorial board for AoCPP and have been a long-standing member from early days in terms of BASPCAN. I've got a social worker by background and was a professional advisor on child protection in the government for over 20 years. And now I do independent work, both in terms of training and other types of consultancy, and have been part of the Hope for Children and Families development work now since 2012.
I'm Stephen Pizzey. I used to be head of social work at Great Ormond Street Hospital, where I had the privilege to be working with Arnon and Jenny and working in a multidisciplinary manner, close up front. And as a social worker, that was a really helpful experience in understanding the perspective of health colleagues and also articulating the role and function of social work in that context. Currently, I act as a social care expert in both professional negligence and care proceedings, and I'm a director of Child and Family Training.
Thank you. And I'm Arnon Bentovim, Child and Adolescent Psychiatrist. I was a founder member of BASPCAN as it was, and have continued to be a member since. And although I'm not currently retired from practice, I worked at Great Ormond Street and the Tavistock Clinic with Jenny and Stephen at the hospital, working with trying to identify children and young people who've been abused within the hospital context, and also establishing a number of services for assessment, identification and treatment, and subsequently founded Child and Family Training in 2000, when the work on the assessment framework began, and working with Jenny and Stephen to develop a number of assessment, analysis and intervention approaches, and we're really very delighted to have the opportunity of talking about our recent paper, which described the approach to intervention and therapeutic work. So if I start by sharing the screen and the set of slides which we hope to illustrate the podcast. This is the paper we're going to discuss, which was published in Child Abuse and Neglect recently. The value of a modular, multifocal therapeutic approach to addressing child maltreatment, the Hope for Children and Families Intervention Resources, a discussion article. And you can see that, as well as ourselves, as the authors, Eileen Vizard, our colleague, is also an author. And we're very delighted that two authors, Bruce Chorpeter and Eric de Leiden from the PracticeWise organization, joined us in putting this paper together, because this really makes it a truly international paper, and we hope will have a relevance to many colleagues in many parts of the world. And we've been delighted that through the ResearchGate, we're up to 1,500 readers. So obviously it's touched a chord, and it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity of discussing it in this podcast. So the basic argument in the paper, and this is from the abstract, is that multiple forms of maltreatment is now accepted as the rule in populations of abused and neglected children. And the second is the addition of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, which adds to the basic forms of maltreatment, intrafamilial violence, mental health, substance abuse, and intergenerational abuse, which is, of course, the factors associated with the triggering of various forms of maltreatment. The paper, we introduce an innovative strategy to organize and to prevent the sequelae of polyvictimization and ACEs, and a modular approach which identifies common treatment elements and common factors from intervention, from effective interventions. And we describe the hope for children and families intervention resources, the findings in a case, and also from the pilot and significant and subsequent training programs. And we feel this could be an important milestone in the protection of children from violence, abuse, and neglect. So the goals of the paper is to review the strengths and limitations of current interventions to address polyvictimization and ACEs from targeted single forms of maltreatment, to discuss how a modular approach may help to organize and address these trends, these understanding, how we developed the intervention resources, and talk about a case and the results from piloting and the strengths and limitations, and particularly the support for the effective implementation of the United Nations Convention for the Rights of the Child. We've been very fortunate that in the development of this particular paper, Van Igendoorn and their colleagues from Holland have developed an extraordinary umbrella synthesis of meta-analyses of child maltreatment, antecedents and interventions. New term for me, an umbrella synthesis, but it's powerful. And they found that risk factors included parents who've been victims of child maltreatment, interpersonal violence, negative personality attributes associated with mental health, and limited social and material resources, all known and now described as part of the factors associated with adverse childhood experiences. But that paper noted a powerful statement here that there was a power failure of interventions to prevent or decrease child abuse and neglect in the next generation, with effect sizes for interventions being substantially smaller than the sizes for antecedents of child maltreatment. We know much more about what factors will result in maltreatment in children and young people, but as they noted, the scarcity of evidence-based means to break the circle of maltreatment is deplorable. They comment that child maltreatment is a widespread global phenomenon affecting the lives of millions of children all over the world, and a betrayal of the UN Conventions of the Rights of the Child. So a powerful statement as a background for our thinking and our work. So we include in the paper this well-known framework for intervention, prevention before the occurrence of maltreatment, universal and targeted interventions, approaches to prevent the recurrence, and prevention of impairment, primary, secondary, and tertiary forms of intervention to prevent the harmful long-term outcomes. We reviewed current interventions in the field of maltreatment. Geraldine MacDonald and her colleagues from Bristol identified a large number of studies, including 62 randomized control trials, but she noted that the majority were for single forms of maltreatment. The NICE guidelines recommended 15 well-evidenced approaches, very valuable for specific services and specific populations, but in our view, not so helpful for the multiple maltreatment, which we've noted is the rule rather than the exception. There has been one systemic review of trials to improve outcomes for children associated with ACEs, but the research so far has focused on children under 5 exposed to parents with mental health difficulties. And as Geraldine MacDonald noted, most children experience more than one form of maltreatment, and there is a growing recognition of the need to take better account of profiles of maltreatment to improve policy and practice. So our solution, the development of modular approaches. Modular approaches were developed to meet the treatment needs of children and young people with a range of mental health problems. Our colleagues at UCLA and PracticeWise and the Boston Children's Vites developed an alternative approach to conceptualizing specific practices in the literature, and they sought ways to build on the knowledge embedded in a large number of evidence-based treatments for mental health. And they developed a structured methodology to map, identify, and categorize the common treatment features from 615 treatments in 322 randomized trials. They distilled out specific practice components and practice elements from the different manuals. And the key issue is that although there are large numbers of treatments available, the reality is that many of these different approaches, whether systemic, dynamic, cognitive behavioral, actually the specific work with the child, with the parent, with the family was often very similar, although coming from different theoretical approaches. So they built on that reality of common practice elements to develop an approach, the modular approach for children with anxiety, depression, and conduct disorder. They developed a multi-disorder intervention system, which incorporated the practice elements, which they had distilled, and a logic coordinating them to have a system which operated as a single, highly effective protocol. And we worked with our colleagues at UCLA to develop the Hope for Children and Families intervention resources. And we distilled common treatment elements from across the field of interventions for individual forms of child maltreatment. And Ian Elliott and myself identified 22 random controlled trials, and we picked out 47 common practice elements, which we categorized as focusing on work with children, young people, parent caregivers, and the family as a whole. A characteristic practice element, which comes across the whole field of intervention, are different ways of helping children and young people and families to describe their experiences. The notion of a trauma narrative, describing the experience, which is a common witnessing element across many different forms of intervention, which is core in working across the field of maltreatment. So we organized 47 practice elements of that nature into a library of modules. And within each of the modules, information from theory and research provided a stepwise approach to provide an evidence-based intervention with scripts, guidance notes, handouts, activities provided by practitioners to support the delivery of these interventions. And we then organized these into a set of themed guides together. Myself and Jenny edited, and many colleagues took key roles in developing these to bring in real practice experience to focus on work with children and young people, parents, caregivers, and the families. And the 9 guides provide an accessible range of resources to be used by practitioners working with children and families in all sorts of settings and at all sorts of levels. So this gives you an example in this slide of the different guides engaging and goal setting with families, modifying abusive and neglectful parenting, working with parents, promoting young people's health development and well-being, so important in the neglect field, promoting attachment, attuned responsiveness and positive emotional relationships when there's been family breakdown, punctuated by physical, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, promoting positive parenting, building on the notion that positive responses, building on strengths is an essential part of helping children and preventing maltreatment. Working with families as groups, promoting positive communication. And then on this side, working with children and young people, addressing emotional and traumatic responsive, disruptive behavior, and working with child sexual abuse. And in the next slide, you can see that in a sense, we have a neglect culture cluster, promoting development, understanding development, promoting safety, care and nutrition, meeting emotional needs, promoting attachment, positive parenting, managing difficult behavior, working with children and families, communication, adverse disruptive behavior, emotional and traumatic responses, and then work and an abuse cluster, coping with parental stress, negative perceptions, targeting abusive and neglectful parenting, supporting parents of children harmed sexually and responsible for sexually harmful behavior. So that through gathering together the common practice elements, gathering them together into a set of modules and focusing them around the assessment framework by working with parents, with the family, with children and young people, that we have a broad-based, holistic approach to prevention of maltreatment. And the approach that we've developed is to help training practitioners in delivering these the elements from these guides. So I'm going to hand over to Jenny to describe a clinical application.
Well, thank you. I'm going to...
Oh, sorry, to Stephen, my apologies.
I'll take Jenny's role here. Jenny's going to take mine later on. Arnon, could we just go back to the previous slide, please?
Yes, sorry.
No, that's it. At the top in the center are the initial stages, establishing a profile for intervention, engagement and goals. And this slide has pulls together the material about an assessment and forming an analysis which has to underpin how we select the various modules from the guides when we're thinking about intervention. And this guide also models working alongside children, young people and their families to establish collaborative goals and engagement so that it's a shared endeavour between professionals, children, young people and their families. And next slide, please, Arnon. We're going to talk about a particular family and just go through some of the stages in the process and probably moving relatively swiftly onto an analysis and thinking about what materials and modules we might wish to use. We have 2 young people really in this family, Laura, age 14, and the subject child, Michael, who's aged 8. Both are children of Moira and Bill Ward. They separated when Michael was 2 years old. Moira Ward subsequently established a relationship with someone called Gary Wills. This was, from her point of view and the children's, a satisfactory relationship over several years. About a year ago, the relationship broke down, and 6 months ago, Moira formed a relationship with Ian Ross. Both Laura and Michael miss the presence of Gary in the family. So if we go to the next slide, please, Arnon. This slide sets out some of the stages in the stages in the process of assessment, analysis, planning interventions, delivering interventions, and evaluating outcomes. Stage 1, typically the receipt of a referral, where one has to evaluate the referral information in terms of possible child maltreatment. Think of adverse childhood experiences that it might be apparent the child or young person has experienced, and consider some of the immediate needs that may require action to ensure immediate safety of the child or young person. In this particular instance, school had referred Michael because he was presenting as anxious and distracted. He'd been late persistently over the last 6 months. This really contrasted to his appearance 9 months ago, when he was generally bright, cheerful, and smartly turned out. He's reported to teachers that mother's new partner, Ian, smacks him, and he finds this distressing. He's having more difficulty with peers at school. So a decision was taken to move to stage 2, where we've got to think about gathering information about Michael's health and development, his needs in that area, parenting capacity, and family environmental factors. And this uses the assessment framework, the structure of the assessment framework, which has been in place in England and Wales since 2000. It's an ecosystemic structure for thinking about information that needs to be gathered and provides a basis for subsequent analysis. Different approaches to assessment can be used. Could involve thinking about what is known about adverse childhood experiences, using structured tools such as strengths and difficulties questionnaires and the family pack of questionnaires and scales, thinking about assessing parenting, and also thinking about assessing the experience of children and young people. And this can be used using what we call the 24-hour interview, and using the home inventory where one can obtain measures, and also using something called the family assessment, where we can really look at family functioning and the impact of family history, such an important area when we think about intervention, and we're also thinking about the prospects for change. The next stage, stage 3, is really to organize that information using the assessment framework. Typically, when people try and organize information, they will muddle up what's happening to the child with what they see or perceive as occurring in the parental capacity side of the triangle. And it's important to distinguish these, because at this stage we're forming hypotheses, and what might be the initial hypothesis may subsequently not prove to be the case. And so Michael's emotional distress could be associated with what is happening with mother's new partner, may also be associated with the loss of Gary, mother's previous partner, and the importance of that relationship to him. So it's important not to jump to conclusions, and so using the assessment framework in that manner helps us avoid leaping to conclusions whilst being aware of the hypotheses that we may be forming. Running alongside that, we need a chronology of salient events in the child's life, and not a lengthy 40-page chronology, but something that has salient information that documents events that have happened to the child and events that will be occurring to the parents or carers at the same time. Then we move to stage 4, and we think about analysing the patterns of strengths and difficulties that we've identified when we've organised the information. And this includes risk, and protective factors, both for the child or young person, parenting, and thinking about the family context and the community context in which the family live, the area in which they live, the challenges presented by that area, and whatever influences may be present in that area, which could include a series of adverse childhood experiences, either within the family or the community. There could be a lot of drug misuse in the community, or it could be that the young person has experienced a parent who's been imprisoned. That's not the case with Michael here. In terms of thinking about strengths and difficulties, it was noted that Moira, the mother, has had a warm relationship with Michael, and indeed Michael's older sister, Laura, in the past. Home was generally well kept. The new partner, Ian, has maintained a steady job and provides successfully financially for the family. Whereas earlier, the score regarding adverse childhood experiences was about 3, involving family separations, history of Moira being treated violently, and Moira's alcohol misuse. This has risen with the addition of emotional neglect, physical neglect of Michael. He's coming to school looking more disheveled, not getting a breakfast before he comes to school, and also physical abuse in the form of smacking and actually prevention of him seeing peers as one of the punishments. The next stage we come to is stage 5, where we really need to think about making judgments based on a systemic analysis about the therapeutic needs of the child, capacity of the family to meet them, within the context of the family and the environment. This will it's not just the therapeutic needs of the child, it will be also the potentially the therapeutic needs of the parents in order to assist them in better meeting the needs of the child. So it's actually looking at the whole system to think about what interventions may indeed be relevant. Arnon, could we go to slide 22, please? I've talked about these slides in that overriding one. So this is a systemic analysis. This is stage 5, and we start out, the systemic analysis is something that was initially developed by Wira Sakara in 1996 and has been developed by Arnon, Professor Tony Cox, Liza Bingley Miller and myself in 2009, and we have subsequently used it to help us think about and form an analysis regarding a child or young person's circumstances. We start with the current health and development for the child or young person. In this instance, we have a neglected appearance, hunger, anxiety, distress, withdrawal. We note that in terms of a strength, there's a warm relationship with Michael has with his mother and his sister, but a poor relationship with mother's partner. And we can see the changes I've alluded to that have occurred at school in terms of isolation, self-esteem and confidence. We then next look at what's triggered this. And there is a pretty clear association with Ian Ross moving to live with Moira. Ian Ross's expectations and demands about how not only Michael but also Laura should conduct themselves, and mother's withdrawal and increasing alcohol misuse. Moira's always had a history of that, but it's really increased. So then we need to look on, and if you could just move to the next one, to predisposing factors and processes that are in the green at the top. Thinking about what's happened to adults in the past when they were children and in previous relationships. Both Ian and Moira had experienced paternal violence when they were children. Ian has some convictions for assault linked to drinking, violence with an ex-partner. And Moira herself has had a series of violent relationships history of depression and drinking. Now the arrows indicate processes, links between these various sections and that may be influencing each other. So on the left-hand side, we then look at what are the harmful maintaining factors and processes that are currently present. We've talked about the increased use of alcohol. We've talked about violence, that Ian actually has been violent. There's been domestic violence with Moira following drinking. Laura's very oppositional to Ian. She's 14 and quite feisty, and this generates conflict. Michael's withdrawal, Ian's use of physical punishment and denigration of Michael, and a general declining standard of basic care. So these are harmful factors and processes. We then look to the protective ones. Mike term these are the strengths that are there. We know there's been a better history of care that Moira has been able to provide previously. Moira loves Michael, is able to demonstrate her affection for him, and you'll see in the section on Michael that's reciprocated. One of the arrows, that's reciprocated. It's a process that's positive for him. Laura is supportive of her mother, and she reports Michael's experiences when with Ian, and so she actually provides a voice to articulate that and name the difficulties. We also have Ian having a steady job, which is very helpful in terms of finances for the family. And generally, even though there's difficulties, the home's well kept. So one of the issues that we face is, well, we've got strengths, we've got difficulties, strengths on the right-hand side, difficulties on the left. What's their influence? What's the strength of their influence and impact upon Michael? You can have a lot of strengths on the right-hand side, but it may well be that one or two significant difficulties outweigh those in terms of their impact upon Michael's health and development. So we come to thinking about, well, what's the likely future for Michael in terms of his health and development if this situation persists as it is? And the prediction would be that he would suffer increasing physical and emotional abuse, become more withdrawn, academic attainment would suffer, and increasing isolation. Now we take each child separately because one child's or young person's response to a situation may be different to others. And so it's useful always to make sure that we do not assume each child in the family is going to respond in the same manner to the same situation. So Arnon, please do the next slide, please. I think if we put everything up, Arnon, please, I think that would be easiest. So if we think about Laura, as she's an articulate young woman, able to express herself, she is now spending more time outside of the house, worried about family relationships and the state of them, struggling with Ian, protective towards Michael and her mother. And if we think about what the likely outlook for her is, and she's a teenager, suffering more emotional stress, relationship with Ian becoming aggressive and abusive, looking for relationships outside the home for support, and becoming involved in risky behaviours outside the home. And indeed, in due course, she actually left the home and went to stay with a friend, and Michael suffered increased physical abuse. I think if we could go on to the next slide, please, Arnon. So the next stage is stage 6, to make decisions and develop a plan for intervention based on the systemic analysis that we have just seen. We need to think about what modules from the various intervention guides could be used alongside family members to achieve planned outcomes for each child or young person. We need to think about the sequence. One of the What we do know about intervention is that success in one area of intervention will help develop success in others. So therefore, we don't want to provide children, young people and their families with too many interventions at the same time, because that will just overload people. We also need to think about interventions being targeted to children, young people and their families' capacity to work with those interventions. Different interventions may be relevant for a parent who has learning difficulties to one who does not. We need to adjust those interventions accordingly. We then would establish, using modules from engagement and goal setting, a planned program of work and think about how to provide that in a coordinated manner. So on the next slide, please. So we use engagement and goal setting. We have a profile for intervention set by the systemic analysis and our understanding of it and the aims that we've collaboratively established with family members. In this particular instance, we'd be using interventions from modifying abusive and neglectful parenting, particularly to help Ian understand how such parenting will impact children and young people. And we'll be thinking about working with Michael and his sister in terms of their experiences and emotional and traumatic responses they've had to the loss of Gary and also to Ian's presence in the family and the nature of the relationship with him. Underpinning this, we'll be using modules from working with families to actually think about how to manage conflict and dysfunction and interrupt those conflict cycles. So next slide, please, Arnon. Stage 7 is where we implement this plan. We monitor its progress and we review its progress, because we need to understand whether the goals that have been set have been achieved. If they've not been achieved, what we might need to adjust. This links to having baseline measures so that we can actually measure what change there has been and actually try and understand whether it's been the intervention that's brought about the change or some other factor that has been present. Use of measures at the point in stage 2 where we're carrying out an assessment that can be repeated can be a helpful way to underpin the beginning of intervention and then review whether it's changed over time. So a typical example would be using the strengths and difficulties questionnaire at the point of assessment, and then being able to use that at various points during the course of intervention so that we can evidence what progress there has been. We can also think about using similar sort of questionnaires, adult wellbeing scale and others, to think about parental progress and the impact on parental mental health. We can use other measures to do with school attendance reports and so forth. So that enables us in stage 7 to really review and establish what the nature of the progress, and we'd review that with family members, continuing the collaborative approach. One of the key areas in this process is to appreciate strengths that are present and seek to build on those and bolster those by addressing some of the difficulties in a collaborative manner with family members. Now, the Hope for Children and Families approaches were piloted before they were finally finished, and Jenny is going to talk about that process.
Thank you. So just next slide, please, Arnon. Just before I talk about what we did here in the UK, just to set out what's been done in relation to the match approach that was developed, as Arnon said, by Weiss and Chorpeter and colleagues in the States. So they've undertaken a number of evaluations of the modular approach that have looked at community research with young people presenting with mental health problems, including traumatic responses. And obviously there is quite a lot of overlap in our area where children have been subject to some form of maltreatment. Their research demonstrated that practitioners who were trained in the modular approach were more effective than those providing usual care, which is a really important point, and were more effective when compared with practitioners trained in individual treatment manuals that formed the basis of the match approach. So having looked at their research, we felt very confident that there was good evidence to support the modular approach, and our next challenge was to obviously see whether it would be effective in relation to child maltreatment. And when we undertook the piloting at the beginning of this process, before we finalised the materials, as Stephen said, we worked with a number of local authorities and voluntary organisation in England. We held 49 different workshops on the guides to help practitioners, their managers, and those providing consultancy stroke supervision stroke support to understand the approach and how to use these resources. We had very positive feedback from those who took part in the pilots, and the majority either strongly agreed or agreed with the evaluation statements regarding the value of the training, the ability to use the materials when working with children and families, increased people's ability and competence in working with trauma, an area people felt quite lacking in confidence in some respects. It's very helpful to help parents understand the effects of abuse and neglect, thinking about meeting children's safety and physical needs, understanding children's development in general, and working with families. So we had a positive response overall to the resources from all of those taking part in the workshops as part of the piloting process. Next. As with any implementation, it was very clear that to have a successful implementation of these resources, we needed to be working with those providing the organisational support in the agency. The involvement and commitment of senior managers is critical so that that filters right through the organisation. Thematic workshops were found to be very helpful, and we had a workshop themed according to each particular guide. For example, working with children who've been sexually abused or sexually abuse others. And then we had a program of providing a reflective supervision and of providing coaching from child and family training to help support and embed the use of the materials into people's everyday practice. One of my things that I always say is it's important that these materials are used as part of business as usual and people integrate them into their daily activities. They're not an add-on, which creates more work still. We found that they were useful in all types of settings across social care, child protection, health, education, and youth justice. And that was, again, a very interesting and heartening finding, that we could use them at all stages of the process, both in terms of early intervention and where abuse and maltreatment had been identified. They were useful for those working with children in foster care, residential or adoptive placements. And in fact, we had some very positive responses from children themselves who were placed in out of family care, which demonstrated the versatility of the materials for children living in their families of origin or those who, for whatever reason, were placed in other family contexts. Next. We are very conscious of the fact that modular approaches have been proven effective in RCTs for children and young people with overlapping mental health disorders and have proven value for those working with child maltreatment. However, we haven't been able to test the effectiveness of the resources for polyvictimization and multiple ACEs through an RCT yet. That's certainly our intention if we can get sufficient funding. And the manuals, because they're constructed from common practice elements, they don't include specialised approaches for significant mental health difficulties for children or young people outside of an established range of responses to maltreatment and adversity. So these are really resources that are developed for most people to use in most settings who are working with children and families, but those who need to provide much more specialist input will be drawing on their specialist expertise in, for example, family therapy or CBT. Next. So our conclusion was that they provide an important building block to transforming and integrating the work of practitioners across different disciplines in different countries. And just to add, we have done a number of trainings in countries and translated the guides into Turkish, Mexican, Spanish, Russian, Arabic. What other languages? Anybody?
We have projects going on in Romania, in Moldova for Romanian, Portugal for Portuguese, India with Hindi, and also we're planning one in Albania for Albania.
Thank you. So we are have already translated them to a number of languages and are continuing to do that. And it is very heartening again to find that not only are they useful for us in the UK, but they have also proved useful in other cultural, linguistic, religious contexts where the legal situation is different to our own here. So we feel that these mark a development which really goes towards assisting us to implement the UNCRC and to help in terms of our journey to end all forms of violence to children by 2030, which is the current initiative that's been undertaken globally by the Initiative to End All Violence to Children. And we obviously will continue to evaluate the materials as we move forward, because that's a crucial part of evaluating their usefulness for children and families around the world. But the findings so far have been extremely positive and worthwhile. Thank you.
Good. Fantastic. Over to you, Wendy.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's very powerful and always very thought-provoking. I'm sure it will gain a lot of interest. And as I say, moving forward, it will be really good to do some additional training. I mean, it's something that underpins the early help preventative model, you know, right the way through. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you.